Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to have you for this event, which is a one UN side event under the theme of climate justice. We are here to talk about a just transition for all and a human right-based approach to climate change. So this event is co-convened by the International Labour Organization, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, the International Organization of Migration, UNESCO, the World Health Organization, World Food Programme, and UN Women. So we have the honor of having for introducing these discussions Mr. Emmanuel Guzman, who is Secretary of the Philippine Climate Change Commission. Welcome, Secretary Guzman. We have Mr. Peter Glynn. He's from the Bond University in Australia. Warm welcome, Mr. Glynn. We have Mr. Alan Miller, who is a special envoy of the Global Alliance on National Human Rights Institutions. Mr. Wheeler, warm welcome. We have then our colleague Claire Horasti, who is Senior Specialist in the Employment Policy Department at the ILO. And last but not least, Bert de Wil, who works with the International Trade Union Confederation Just Transition Center. We are still expecting Professor Jean-Pascal van Ypersele from the University of Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium, who is going to join us certainly in a few minutes. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of this discussion is to offer a platform where we can look at the interface between these discussions taking place here on climate change, the Just Transition Decent Work agenda, and how to bring a human right-based approach in this context. So we are going to address a few questions specifically addressed to each of our panelists. So the session is interactive. I will be inviting our distinguished panelists to introduce their issues in 3 to 4 minutes. We will do that first round of opening. Then we have the first part of interaction with all of you. And we go for a second round of discussion. Now, I just wanted to start with Claire Horasti. First of all, recognizing that we have a gender very much imbalanced session, so maybe correcting for that, let us have Claire help us introduce the subject. So Claire, we are here to look at how employment issues matter in the context of climate change discussions. What type of impact are we seeing, and that you can tell us about from the perspective of the ILO, so that you can help us frame a little this discussion?
Thank you, Kamal. Good afternoon, everyone. You cannot hear. Is it better now? Okay, so it's the green button. Okay, well, the transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy will affect employment in different ways. Some new jobs will be created, other jobs will need to adapt, while other jobs, especially in the high carbon sectors, will either be reallocated or will be eliminated. And many existing professions will be redefined, and there will be new profiles and skills required. There have been a number of studies trying to estimate the impact of the transition to unemployment. And we did a review of all these studies, and they show that the net impact will be positive, maybe modest, but should be positive. One estimate shows that up to 60 million jobs could be added to global employment if the right policy mix is in place. Net gains, this study says that net gains can be achieved because of higher labor intensity of green sectors and because there will be more linkages to the national economy of the creation of green jobs. But positive net effects are there, but we can also see negative impacts in certain sectors. So depending on which sectors we look, there can be some more negative impacts, especially in the high carbon, highly polluting sectors, where there we see some job losses. These might be relatively small because we see that these sectors in general employ a low share of total population. If we take the EU 25 countries, for example, the 10 most polluting industries, which represent 90% of emissions, only employ 15% of the workforce. And these will be the 15% most affected. So when we balance the positive and negative, we see a modest positive impact on employment. Another aspect we need to look at is not just the quantitative, how many, but also the qualitative side. The transition to a low-carbon economy might affect the quality of jobs. Some occupations might have new occupational hazards, some health issues linked to it. For example, pollution control, waste management, even windmill construction, etc., where we might see some occupational safety and health issues emerging. And also, we might see some positive impact on job quality in sectors where, for example, we'll use less pesticides, or there will be more stringent regulation that will improve the working conditions of the workers in the sectors affected. So this is also an important aspect to look at, the quality of the jobs. And we have looked at some studies that show that, in fact, the green economy could be an opportunity to increase the quality of new jobs created. And that's really something we should try and surf on. So I said there will be new jobs created. Some will disappear completely. Some will adapt or reallocate. But this will depend also on the time frame. So there will be some short-term effects. So if we close a coal mine, there will be an immediate effect on the workers working in the coal mine, who will lose their jobs. But we also need to look at the longer-term effects, which might, take more time, but be more positive on the workers. So we also need to take into account these short-term, long-term impacts on employment. But basically, because I know I have only 3 minutes, the employment impact will depend on the labor market conditions. And usually, positive impacts are based on assumptions of perfect labor markets, where supply and demand adjust automatically. So it means workers have the skills required, they can move geographically without any constraints, and wages adjust automatically. They're not. But we all know that in reality, this is not the case. So the workers affected might not have the skills required to get a new job in an emerging sector, or they might not be able to move, or if they need to move, they might need support to do so. So there is a need to put in place policies to support the workers affected so that they can grasp the opportunities offered elsewhere in the labor market. So just to conclude this introduction, this means that we need the right policies in place, and that governments and social partners need to analyze ex ante the potential impact on employment so that they can plan and put in place the right response measures to help workers affected benefit from the transition.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Havarsi, for framing for us these different types of impacts that we would see in the world of work. But I think what you have said will only make important sense if we bring it down to what it means for countries. And we are honored to have Secretary Guzman here. And Secretary, please allow me to turn to you and see in the context of the Philippines, which we all know is one of the countries highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But we have seen that the Philippines has taken a number of significant policy initiatives, including the adoption of a Green Job Act by the Senate. So may I just invite you to tell us a little how, from a policy perspective, you are picking on the issues that Ms. Horasty has framed for us. Over to you, Secretary, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I will be sharing with you our experience in the Philippines, particularly our collaboration with the ILO on the recent developments of advancing green jobs as well as just transition. Last year, we passed a law which is called the Green Jobs Act. And sometime last month, the implementing rules and regulations were also released. Now, this Green Jobs Act calls for the greening of the workplaces and also standard setting, accreditation, and certification of green operations, green practices in the workplaces. So, and the Climate Change Commission, which I head, is responsible for this standard setting and as well as establishing the accreditation and certification process. It will also be linked to fiscal policy because there's some incentives being provided by the law, such as much as 50% a tax break on investments in greening of the enterprises. Now, in the Philippines, we had also one of the pilot countries. We're also one of the pilot countries for the application of the ILO policy guidelines on just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all. The Just Transition Initiative in the Philippines is in support of the implementation of the Philippine Green Jobs Act and in leveraging the process of structural change towards a greener, low-carbon, climate-resilient economy that creates decent jobs on a significant scale. In the Philippines, the Just Transition Initiative has established a multi-stakeholder social dialogue and cooperation mechanism that brings together government, employers, and workers' representatives, private sector academe, civil society, development partners, and other key stakeholders to jointly address issues concerning greening of the economy. Now, in this context, what the Climate Change Commission has initiated early this year was to hold a series of roundtable discussions with the stakeholders concerned. And these roundtables address some policy issues on green jobs, and we had to address also the finalization of our nationally determined contribution. So maybe you're aware that on Earth Day, the Philippines has joined the Paris Agreement, and it's enforced. And we're about to submit our nationally determined contribution, the first NDC, by the first quarter of next year. So consultations are still going on, and part of this consultation is the incorporation of the green jobs in the NDC and in the transition action plans that the NDC will require. So in June, discussions provided an overview on the Paris Agreement, including the provision on just transition and the Philippine Green Jobs Act. And in August, we had discussions focused on the framework of the National Human Resource Development Plan for Green Jobs. You know, the law asks for a National Human Resource Development Plan. And it's a big challenge for our Department of Labor and Employment to come up with this national plan. Consultations still going on at the moment. It will have to be a comprehensive plan to cover all sectors. Yeah? In September, we had discussions focused on the outcome of the ILO Green Jobs and Green Skills Study and the progress on the nationally determined contribution. Now, inputs from these discussions articulated that the government alone could not create the paradigm shift to a low-carbon and climate-resilient development. The challenge is so enormous that it requires active and effective convergence with and among all stakeholders. So based from our experience, social dialogue plays a vital role in building consensus on the development pathway and bringing policy coherence needed to ensure a just transition. It provides an opportunity to discuss comprehensively the necessary measures needed to ease the transition, including the interlinkages of the implementation of these measures. Now, just to share with you the outcome of our recent consultations also, what the challenges that we face in line with the implementation of the Green Jobs Act. There are three things that we have to face squarely. The challenge to raise awareness in all sectors. Not all are, in the same page as to, the principles and concepts of greening, what's green job is. This need to be defined well. What do we mean by just transition? This will need to be defined well and to be understood by the public and all stakeholders across all sectors. So that's one. Secondly, we need huge investment in capacity building. And as I mentioned, national human resource development plan will have to be developed and adopted. And thirdly, we need to find a way to access climate finance in the most efficient way to support all these requirements for implementing our Green Jobs Act and for the pursuit of just transition. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Secretary Guzman. I think you very well framed the policy initiatives. I think what you have said about the Green Job Act and the incentive structures that you are putting together. But I also want to underscore the way you put social dialogue as an essential element in the shift towards low-carbon economy and a just transition for all. And I think it's a very good way to bring on board the role of social partners in this transition. And again, we're very fortunate to have Mr. Peter Green to be here with us and Bert Duell from the ITUC. So I might just start with you, Bert, to invite you. Trade unions have really been pushing strongly for an agenda of this work and just transition to be part of the global response to climate change. So could you please tell us now which way are you going, having this in the preamble of the Paris Agreement and negotiations and the response measures, and also if you'd like to maybe react to what we have heard from Secretary Guzman on social dialogue. What does it mean and how significant it is for workers' organizations? Mr. Wild, please.
Thank you very much, Kamal, for the invitation and the opportunity to speak here. As Kamal indicated, I'm representative from the ITUC, that's the International Trade Union Confederation. It's the body that groups worldwide all the trade unions. I work for the Belgian trade union, and I work for a specific center that's been created by the trade unions to work on just transition, the Just Transition Center. And it's a fact that since 10 years we are working on, together with other civil society organizations, to have a recognition inside the UNFCCC of the role of workers and the impact on workers of climate change and climate change policies. That's the fundamental concept that from trade unions we want to achieve. Recognition of the impact of climate change on workers and the role that workers can play in these policies. They have to be on the table. We call that just transition. Maybe for some it's maybe a difficult word and there's many things under it. And in fact, for people in many different countries, it means different things. For example, for a person working in Germany in a coal mine or in a coal-powered power station that might close in the future if we have certain climate policies, this just transition means something different from a worker over the border in Poland, where political conditions are different, social contexts are different, social protection aspects are different. And just transition, in fact, as our colleague Claire Harastias was saying, in the end, climate policies will have a mild effect on labor markets. Only 15% of the labor market will be affected. And from a macroeconomic perspective, this is very good news. This is why also from trade union side we push for this transition. But these 15% of the labor force, it's a huge number of people. And it could be you. It could be your parent, your sister. And that's why we need these just transition policies, also to give a future for maybe on a global perspective, limited numbers of people that will be directly affected by the climate change policy. So for us, we start that just transition means for the trade unions that we have to attack climate policies. That's the first aspect of it. Second, it's right-based. It's based on the right for decent work, the right for workers and families to have good living conditions, and we build very much on the workers' rights from the ILO that we agreed there. And then third is how do we have to get this? And then we have an array of instruments that we think are useful to use to push for these policies. We need good planning. All economic sectors have to be involved with social partners on the table on what will be the impact in transport, energy production, housing. All policies have to have a view on the steps that we have to take for climate change policies. Very important is social protection, because these 15%, they might lose their job, and we need good social protection schemes. And the ILO, and another point, is social dialogue, as has been mentioned before also. And the guidelines from the ILO offer a very practical instrument for countries, for organizations, for social partners to actually start working on it. Basically, my main message where I would like to end with in the introduction is that maybe we need some mind shift. Social justice, protection of human rights, these are often add-ons to the climate policies. It's an extra box where you have to tick. We ask for climate policies that I should respect workers' rights and just human rights and so on. But maybe we have to turn it around. At least that's where we at the trade unions are convinced of, that to have these ambitious climate policies that we need to really protect the climate, to keep the warming under the 2 degrees, we should not see human rights and workers' rights as a box to tick. Yeah, we take them into account. They are dealt with somewhere in the policy. No, we have to do right from the start, put the people around the table and say, okay, what is this huge transition of our economy? Which sectors will lose? Which sectors need very profound restructuration? And how are we going to do it? And how are we going to pay it? Who will pay it? In which way are the households paying it? What's the contribution of business side? Which economic instruments can we put on the table? And who will pay for the transition? And according to us, a very frank dialogue with social partners, with other partners, preferably in a tripartite construction, will in the end be the only way to realize the climate change objectives. And this process of taking these issues on board, having the just transition aspects in the NDCs, in the national climate plans, and then moving further with a clear view of reaching the climate objectives. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Bert, and I really appreciate the way you've brought down all what we're talking about to people. I think there is care for the climate, but because of the fact that it impacts on people, and we all hear about about human well-being. So I just, you have referred to the right-based approach, and we'll hear in a minute from Mr. Alan Miller on that, from that perspective, and you've also talked about the instruments, you know, the policy instruments beyond what we have heard from Secretary Guzman. I think in the second round, we'd like to have Ms. Horasty to tell us a little more about those labor market tools and instruments that play a role. But before that, I just would like to now turn to Mr. Peter Glenn from the Bond University in Australia. Peter, we all understand that enterprises will be indispensable to address climate change, but they will also be indispensable to ensure that this transition is just. And often when we think about just transition, there is a lot of focus on workers and what we have heard from Bert, but we also understand that there are just transition issues for enterprises in the way they may have to change their business production process methods and so on. So could you please tell us from a business and private sector perspective, what is your take? Peter, please.
Excuse me. Thank you, Kamal, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Just one point of clarification before I start. I understand the sign at the front says I'm from Bonn University, and Bonn University might be offended. Clarification is I'm from Bond University in Australia.
But just take it as I'm francophone, so it comes from there.
Anyhow, I'm a labour market practitioner, representative of business on labour issues, but I'm also I've also researched and published on the impact of, or published on business and trade union impact on labour policy. Enterprises will, in large part, be the delivery agents for climate action, both public and private sector initiated. So it will be where you look to see if, in fact, workers are being delivered a just transition and decent work.
Sorry. I didn't got the question. Sorry, excuse me.
Labour market... Right, we got it? Yep. Labour market behaviour works best when there are strong labour institutions in government, labour law, labour courts, labour inspectors, where there's strong stakeholder engagement in the process, employer organisations and trade unions, and well-articulated and long-term public policy. Where there's weak policy, no targeted policy, enterprises will act individually to reduce emissions, to ensure they have workers with the skills and in the number required, and they'll conform to the labour law and practice of the jurisdiction in where they're working. These are examples of... no, they're not. Now they are. Thank you. These are examples of stable and targeted public policy, and I'll speak more to them in the second round. But they're public policy initiated to address energy efficiency in buildings and emission reduction strategies. Importantly, each had long-term commitments and were supported by comprehensive plans for the labour market, and they recognised the need to increase the number of workers, that those workers needed to be trained, and that the workers' traditional skill profile needed to change with the new technologies. And were undertaken in countries where labour institutions of government were strong, labour courts, labour law, labour courts, the inspectorate. All right. Never mind. Next slide is a case study of the Hazelwood Power Station closure, which is an example of job losses, but yeah, I know, I can't.
It's the one before. It's the one
the
before.
previous one?
It's the previous one.
Never mind.
Yeah, that's it.
Never mind, we've missed it. But
It's the right one.
oh, I'm sorry, but it's not. Oh, it is now. Sorry, right. Example of best practice, but in an instance where there are significant job losses and the total community was affected. And again, I'll speak more to that if we get a chance in the second round. But the case of developing countries. Now we've gone forward. There we go. case of developing countries is different. Developing countries generally have weak labour market institutions and a high informal economy not represented by employer organisations and trade unions. And the transition to a low-carbon economy offers the opportunity to introduce a formal framework to the behaviour of the labour market. If we use India as an example, India, its NDC has committed to significant emission reduction strategies across its transport sector and across its energy sector. But importantly, the cost of those programs, as it says in its NDC, are $200 billion for adaptation and $800 billion for mitigation. But importantly, those funds are going to be externally provided. None of it's going to be funded internally or by the Indian government or industry society alone. Importantly, that international assistance, climate finance, and through the institutions that provide that finance, the GEF, the Green Climate Fund, the European Union, the International Development Banks, all adopt the World Bank standards for environmental and social safeguards, the 9 environmental and social safeguards, which cover the protection of labour. Gender issues are looked after, health and safety is in place, health of the community is in place, cultural heritage is protected, and so on. Now, it's through these mechanisms that we have the chance that become the de facto formal institutions, formal governing labour market behaviour in that region where it otherwise doesn't prevail. Environmental and social safeguards too, labour and working conditions. The subcomponents of each of these details, if ever you've been involved in an application for climate finance, are thorough. They are comprehensive, and you don't get the money if you do not follow the rules. So in regions, in countries where there are weak institutions, this is the process that is being used, or that is in fact delivering that formality and control over the behaviour of enterprises and workers and the institutions. Finally, and importantly, this is what I want to say. What do enterprises want from COP23? And what do we expect will deliver a just transition? 5 important points. Action to deliver the objectives of holding global warming to the ambition of the Paris Agreement. Pressure on parties to increase commitments in their NDCs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Pressure on parties to embrace all the requirements of the Paris Agreement. Just transition, respect for gender, capacity building, etc. Adopt the reporting, monitoring and evaluation rules under which the parties and their NDCs will be accountable, and increase the amounts of climate finance which will be delivered through those institutions, as I mentioned. And this will go, in our view, a long way to transitioning economies, the workplace, and delivering a just transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Green. I think, again, I have from Bond University. I'm a Francophone, so I speak English from a Francophone perspective. But I just think one thing that is very interesting is to have heard both from workers' representatives and Peter speaking from an enterprise perspective, a demand on parties to increase the level of ambition. And I think this is a very, very important message to governments, that social partners around this table at least are aiming for much more than what we have in the current NDCs. And I would like, ladies and gentlemen, we'll have just in a minute the time to interact with all of you to think about what that could mean in the context of the UNFCCC processes, where it is a party-driven process with observers, but it looks like there are observers that want to go even faster than what the parties are putting on the table. But before we go to that, we have all heard about human rights and what it means in the context of this discussion. And I just would like to turn now to Professor Mr. Alan Miller, Special Envoy of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. Mr. Miller, national human rights institutions and the human rights mechanisms, they support a right-based approach to implementation of the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda. So could you please tell us what elements do you see that need to be in the core processes from that perspective of human rights? Mr. Miller, please.
Thanks very much, Kamal, and thanks to the hosts of this side event for the opportunity not only to contribute but to learn from the panelists, as I've already done, and also from yourselves when we get to the interaction. And I'll only take a few minutes not to delay that part of the process. But I am well aware that many of you out there may not be already familiar with what are national human rights institutions, what might they bring to the table in terms of added value. So let me just say a very few words by way of introduction about national human rights institutions. They have been established now by legislators in over 100 countries as independent bodies to promote and protect human rights nationally and globally. And we are coordinated by and within the UN system. Our mandates vary from country to country, but commonly they would include the mandate to advise governments on how to implement their international human rights obligations, as well as their national ones, to raise public awareness on human rights and to empower the public, to monitor and report to the United Nations on the extent to which governments are implementing the obligations they've entered into under UN human rights treaties, and to carry out inquiries into systemic human rights problems in a country, to make recommendations, and also to take cases of affected individuals or communities alleging human rights denials. In terms of the Paris Agreement and more broadly the SDGs, the approach of, and I'll say NHRIs instead of repeating national human rights institutions, the approach of NHRIs towards the Paris Agreement might be characterized as one of constructive accountability. In terms of the constructive part of that, we would work with governments to implement the human rights principles of participation, non-discrimination, prioritizing the most vulnerable, transparency, accountability, and to raise public awareness of these principles, that these principles are of benefit and the rights of the public itself. In terms of accountability, NHRIs carry out monitoring and reporting on the extent to which governments are meeting their human rights obligations. We have speaking rights within the United Nations system, so that we will advise the various human rights bodies within the UN as to how not only are the governments carrying out their human rights obligations and what the situation is on the ground, but we're now increasingly cross-referring the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals with the treaty obligations that states have already entered into. So, for example, the right to work under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So it's a means of policy coherence that governments are able to take the obligations they've already made on a legal basis and provide a framework of accountability in which the commitments under the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals can be rendered accountable. We also will carry out inquiries and take cases from affected individuals. Now, let me just give you an example. I was very interested and appreciated learning from the Philippines, which is clearly taking a lead, and the question of social dialogue, policy coherence was very welcome. And also just picking up what Peter was saying about the role of the private sector, which can have both a positive and a negative impact, as we're well aware, on climate change. So in the Philippines, the National Human Rights Institution there is also breaking ground and developing good practice. And let me outline in general what it is doing on the ground. It received a petition from indigenous peoples, trade unions, and environmental defenders about the impact of what's called the carbon majors, the private sector, on the right to life, livelihoods, and way of life of communities that were impacted. Now, I'm not going to say too much about the inquiry because it's underway and it will be reported upon within the next few months. But what this inquiry is going to be addressing is what are the obligations of a government to protect its population from the impact of climate change by non-state actors, such as the private sector? And what are the treaty obligations, what are the commitments made under Paris and the SDGs that governments should be taking into account to ensure that they are protecting the rights and the livelihood and ways of life of affected parts of their population? Secondly, it will be looking at the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. What is the responsibility of the private sector to respect the rights of those that it has an impact upon, which can be positive or, as we know, can also be negative. So recommendations will then come out of this inquiry to ensure that there is this policy coherence across the state and also recognition of the framework based on human rights in which the private sector, under the UN guiding principles, has its responsibilities. Finally, let me turn to what we would like to come out of COP23 and the subsequent negotiations leading up to COP24. We would like the guidelines to facilitate the collaboration at a national level of governments with key national actors. That would certainly include trade unions, national human rights institutions, and many other bodies. We would also like the UNFCCC to establish a focal point on human rights that is able to translate a lot of the human rights principles and language on a consistent basis to influence the negotiations that will be taking place between the COPs, and not just that human rights comes up at side events when the COP takes place. Let me conclude with an early warning, however, on all of this. NHRIs have been very actively engaged for the last 2 or 3 years with the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, under the follow-up and review process that governments have committed to undertake as to what they're doing to implement the SDGs, there is a process where about 50 or 60 countries over the last 2 years, and credit to them, they have put themselves forward and reported to the UN high-level political forum in New York every July what steps they have taken to operationalize their commitments under the SDGs. We've also presented a parallel report looking at those countries to whom we acknowledge they are taking initiative and playing a responsible role. But we've looked at what is the situation within those countries in terms of the capacity of civil society to participate in the design and implementation of national SDG plans. And we have found that there is a real problem of a shrinking democratic space in many, many countries around the world, in fact, the majority, where it's been closed down in a very real way, the extent to which civil society, environmental bodies, trade unions, national human rights institutions, the public as a whole, can effectively participate in the design and the implementation of national plans under the SDGs. And we're concerned, therefore, that that early learning experience, which we are bringing to the attention of the UN, shouldn't also become the early experience of the first few years of the Paris Agreement. I think the closing line in all of this is that the social and economic transformation which is necessary to achieve the Paris Agreement and fulfill its potential can only be achieved with the participation of all of us, and particularly those sections of the community which are most impacted by climate change. and that very much includes the workers and their rights to a just transition. So thanks very much, and I look forward to the interaction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miller, for really emphasizing the role of national human rights institutions, but also for giving very clear and concrete proposals as to what could be done even within the UNFCCC, including this idea of a focal point on human rights. So we now have Professor Van Ippersel, but I would like, before we give the floor to Professor, to just hear from you, ladies and gentlemen, on the different points that we have heard from our distinguished panelists, and invite you to make any comments, any suggestions, or initial reactions to what you have heard, or if there are individual questions, you may please raise them. If you would like to direct them to any of our panel members, please do so. Just please identify yourself when you wish to take the floor. So any, I see Madame there, but we shouldn't have a microphone. Madame, please.
Irina Novak, University of Freiburg. I have a question to the representative of ILO. You were mentioning that number of 15% of labor markets will be affected by transition to a low-carbon economy. 15, right? Around that. Could you maybe just give a couple of details about the regional distribution of this 15%, especially from the perspective of global North and global South?
All right, thank you. Claire, please allow me to just see if there are other among the audience who would like to make any other comments or questions. Yes, Madame. Please. Yeah, wait. All right, perfect.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. I'm interested in the right to the city, the possibility of the right to the city being asserted through access and maybe co-management of ecosystem services, which I think is a little bit outside where you guys have been talking about it today, but that's why I came to this room. So if you had something to add to that. And also, this is maybe a logistical comment. I'm wondering about how this goes for other rooms also. People are taking notes, simultaneous notes in this room, how they might be filtered up, or if there's a way to get everyone's name and comments later. Just, I'm interested in how this meeting is kind of generating the work of itself as we go.
All right, thank you. But please identify yourself when you take the floor.
Yeah, sorry. My name's Andrea Godchuk, and I study sustainable urbanism at Washington University in St. Louis.
All right, thank you very much. Is there any other comment or question before I revert to the panel? Okay, I see two people, sir and madame. And yes, please go ahead, sir. And
I'm Professor Sanjay Paswan from India. Likewise, LPG era, liberalizations, privatizations, globalizations era, has promised so many opportunities for the working class. But so far as the Indian experience experienced that the growth of the ultra poors are increasing, and super rich also, that number is increasing in India. So this marginalized section, especially the Dalit people, tribal people of that place, is also doubting that this climate change may bring some problem for the poor of South Asian countries, especially. So it may not prove a disaster for them. So what, especially ILO, we are expecting a lot of things from the ILO people. what can be done for the people who are already in the disadvantaged position. Because, you know, LPG have, of course, the hiatus between the rich and the poor have been widened. So people doubt that even this climate change may bring another setbacks for them. So this comes under the human rights also issue, because these marginalized sections, the people on the margins, they're very much scared of these things. So I would like to say that if there is any way so that this climate justice can be reinforced well in time, it may not be another hawks like LPG era. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I saw two more hands, so let's just do those two more questions. Madame first, and then here, and then we come back to our panel. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I just have a comment. My name is Anastasia Savura. I'm from Fiji. I work at a resort, which is a 5-star resort, and not going to name anything here. It helps in providing awareness to little children as well as communities in engagement through ocean conservation and many more projects. I'd just like to say that as young people, we are already engaged to try and bridge these sectors so they're more involved in climate conservation, and it would be a little bit more helpful if it's appreciated on a global platform, so that it gives us that little bit of push and keep us motivated to try and do more and try and engage these sectors, which everybody is complaining about in our daily work. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Madame. Yes.
Hi, I'm Alana from the Philippines, and I work with Climate Tracker. My question is for Mr. Manuel de Guzman, our PH delegation head. What is the level of commitment of the Philippines in terms of just transition, considering that the Philippines is dependent on coal? In last year's energy mix, we are dependent on coal for 48% of our energy, and we are currently about to open 27 more or 29 more coal plants, and the President has expressed President Duterte has expressed support for these coal plants. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I must say that we have somehow corrected for our gender imbalance here in the way you have engaged in this discussion. I see we had two specific questions. I think, Claire, there's something about for you on what is the regional distribution when we speak of this 15% of the workforce mostly impacted by climate change. And Secretary Guzman, I think there's a question of how the Philippines is going for just transition, accounting for the role and significance of the coal industry. And I think there are two very important questions. The one on inequality. And I think this is something I would put to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, to consider and perhaps react to. And the second point on the role of young people and the issue that you have raised, I think it's more of an intergenerational equity issue, which is at the center of the climate agenda. So ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to just turn to you, perhaps. So we start with Ms. Harasti and Secretary Guzman, and I just take the opportunity to turn after to Professor Vani Persele to hear from his perspective. Thank you.
On the question about the regional distribution, first let me clarify the number I gave. So this is the 15% of total employment is just for the EU 25 countries. So what I said was that if you take the 10 most polluting industries in the EU 25, and these 10 most polluting represent 90% of emissions in the EU 25, they represent 15% of total employment in the EU 25. So that's for that region. I don't have here the numbers for other regions, but if you take countries that are like China, where they have a lot of coal mines and very polluting industries, it's about the same. 15% of total employment that is impacted by the current National Development Plan that is closing some of these industries. I know the numbers are available for the US also. I don't have it here, but I don't have like a full regional distribution. There will be a report coming out in January, end of January, with these data, but they're not yet publicly available, so I can't give them to you. There was a question on inequality. I think that one was for me as well, and it's true that the transition may exacerbate existing inequalities, especially because workers affected, most directly affected by the transition will be the lower skilled workers. And if we think of communities, because I spoke mostly of workers, but it's also communities that are affected, they're usually the most vulnerable communities, and you mentioned some of them. So yes, there is a big risk of exacerbating inequalities, and this is why we insist very much on the necessity to put in place appropriate policies to mitigate this impact, to address this and try and make the impact on these groups as little as possible and avoid even bigger inequalities. And I think I might have a chance later to go into some of the policies we can put in place. But most of them are, if you can access our just transition guidelines that were published by the ILO, I mean here the organization, the tripartite organization, then it lists a number of responses. And this is very much at the heart of our preoccupations, is to avoid increased inequality and that some workers and populations and communities are totally left out.
Well, thank you very much. I was hoping to turn to Secretary Guzman for the question on the Philippines. Secretary, would you like to react?
Actually, the Philippine government is very much committed to a just transition. In fact, at the moment, right now, we are updating our National Climate Change Action Plan that will be that will articulate green jobs and just transition, and that's pursuant to law. And as regards energy resilience, we are undertaking right now, it's still an ongoing process, what we call the National Energy Policy Review, which was launched last year and continues to be reviewed. And there are also major developments in the legislature, like the coal tax is being deliberated upon. No? So in line with this, I think it's important to bring to focus the need to integrate all these desired transition and desired actions by all sectors in our nationally determined contribution. Because this NDC, as we see it, is our industrial strategy or industrial plan. It's essentially going to open up the country and investments in the areas of agriculture, waste, industry, transport, forestry, and energy. Right now, if coal is still in the horizon, the equation could later on change if technology for green, clean energy is already available to us. And that's why we have to emphasize at this point accelerated action by all, especially those who are capable of extending support pursuant to the Paris Agreement in terms of capacity building, technology development and transfer, finance for adaptation, and mitigation. These should be immediately available to developing countries so that we can undertake as soon as possible the leapfrogging that we need, and that we have to be that we're able to effectively wean away ourselves from dirty fossil fuel energy sources. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Secretary Guzman. I think you've touched upon the issue of equity, and Claire, you've done so as well. I just wanted at this point, before I turn to Professor Miller, Mr. Green, and Duell, to bring into our discussion Professor Vanni Purcell. Professor, UNESCO has been working for the past 10 years to develop an ethical framework to address climate change. And I think this is relevant to some of the important questions that we have heard here. So in your view, how do these ethical principles contribute to a just transition, and what role could they play in the ongoing processes within the UNFCCC? Professor, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and my apologies for being late. I was facilitating on behalf of the Fijian Presidency an event, the Open Dialogue this morning, and I had to run from the other zone. I ran as quickly as I could, but not fast enough. Yes, I've been participating over the last 2 years to the drafting of UNESCO declaration related on principles related to excuse me. Let me take the exact title, then I won't make mistake. A declaration of ethical principles in relation to climate change. So it's an 8-page declaration. The final version of it, I only have an embargoed copy here, and I don't know whether it will be the final version, but you can find the draft version easily if you Google UNESCO Ethical Principles Climate Change, and you'll probably see a text that's almost as the final version. The final version should be approved if everything goes well, let's touch wood, because this was a long process, next Monday. And there should be an event in this zone next Wednesday in the UNESCO pavilion to present the final version of that declaration. It's at 1:15 in the UNESCO pavilion. So I cannot tell you what's in the final draft and how it differs possibly from the final version, but I can tell you that the ambition that the authors had assembled by UNESCO is to have a reference text that is at the same level as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights related to ethics and climate change. And it contains six principles. And again, I base what I'm saying on the draft. I cannot guarantee it will be exactly the same, but usually at this late stage, the changes are very limited. So the first principle is prevention of harm. Of course, it's detailed. The second is precautionary approach. The third one is equity and justice. I'm just quoting the title of the relevant section. Of course, I don't have the time to enter into the details. The fourth one is sustainable development. The following one is solidarity. And the last one is titled Scientific Knowledge and Integrity in Decision Making. So I've been asked to give you maybe one or two examples on how those principles might inspire some discussions. In the draft, again, of the Article 2, which talks about prevention of harm, there's a sentence recommending states and all actors to seek and promote transnational cooperation before deploying new technologies that may have negative transnational impacts. And I'm just quoting that example because that's one sentence that could be used as a reference in the discussions that might take place, and that some are taking place already, around geoengineering. So it's clearly a sentence calling for transnational cooperation before doing anything in that direction. Another example is using a paragraph in the Equity and Justice article, Article 4 of that declaration. It calls for fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in addressing climate change. Relevant actors, etc., should work together, etc., in solidarity with the poorest and most vulnerable people. So, of course, this article and other elements of that text are very relevant and can be used as reference when issues such as how to share, how to divide, how to distribute in a fair manner, in an equitable manner, the remaining and shrinking carbon budget that would allow humanity to stay below well below the 2-degree target or below the 1.5-degree target. It can also be used as a reference, but this has been discussed at length before I arrive, I think, when adaptation and damages from impacts, which everybody knows is affecting in a more severe manner the most vulnerable and the poorest, are handled, and also is relevant to the issue that was discussed just when I arrived, the just transition and the impact that measures to make that big transition towards a new economy, in a sense, and how in that transition the impacts on workers, for example, which will have to change jobs and move to new activities, will have to be taken into account. So these are a few examples of how this declaration, which I very much hope will be approved next Monday, will be applicable and used in the discussion. Without being naive, on the other hand, we also know that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, despite its long existence, doesn't mean it's automatically applied everywhere and used everywhere with the same political will, but maybe this text can be a little bit useful around those discussions, and this is the hope we had in drafting it on behalf of UNESCO. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. I very much hopeful that these ethical principles will be adopted, and they're very much relevant to what we have just heard from the comments. And I just wanted to turn back to the panel and remind that we heard about intergenerational equity, the role of youth, again, issues of equity. And so may I just come back to you for any reaction to those first questions? Mr. Duell or Mr. Miller, Mr. Glynn, any other questions? So let us just start with Bert, please.
Thank you. There were several questions where I would like to reflect on. First, there was the woman that indicated the right to the city, and she was wondering whether there is a link with the issue here, and I think there is very much a link. Trade unions in general, or at least in my trade union, once you become member, you have a double membership. You have a first membership on the work floor where you work, and then a second membership for the same price where you live. And we always speak about workers, their families, and their communities, and they have to be socially just organized, and we want to have a voice on all levels. So also in the development of sustainable cities, I think it's very important, and we with the Just Transition Center, for example, are very much working on that, organizing round tables in Oslo, Vancouver, to see how we can advance climate change and worker rights together. On the link of on the question, it was not directed to me, but the Just Transition commitment of the Philippines, I also wanted to express my support for the intentions and the plans and the work that the Philippines government is doing on linking climate change policies, the development of the NDCs, and having a link with labor market policies, the impact of green jobs, human resources reports. That's exactly what we need. That's what we need in every country. And it's a pity that I haven't seen so many countries yet that are doing it. Also, last week I spoke with my colleagues from Philippine Trade Union Centro, and who was responsible for work in the energy sector. And they also have very clear views of how the future of the energy provision in Philippines have to develop, how we can phase out step by step dependence on coal, and what are the alternatives. So these people have to be together at the table and have to share their ideas for the future, for future and good climate policy. And then finally, one point about inequality. Of course, I support 200% the vision that climate change, the transition, will exacerbate existing inequalities, and that we have to develop very good policies to deal with this. But there is also something else, and that's also very important. Maybe you have heard of an American researcher, Juliette Schor, and she has studied the impact of inequality on climate policies. And we see that the more unequal countries are, their climate policies are worse. So in more equal societies, we will have quicker and better climate policies. So there is a very clear link between both. There is much more support in society, civil society support, when there is more equality in your society, and then you will get better climate policies. And that's also a very important point that we from the trade union side would like to stress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Miller?
Thanks very much. I don't want to take up too much time because the more people engage, the better. But I would like to respond directly to the question from India, because I think that does go to the heart of all of this debate. Thanks very much. This is why I think the lessons need to be learned as we deliberate how to implement the Paris Agreement, and be very real in our understanding of the context in which the Paris Agreement is going to be introduced. The Sustainable Development Goals, at its very heart, has the notion that nobody is to be left behind. And that's in recognition of the increasing inequality in so many of our countries, in part fueled by globalization, which has not benefited everyone and has left far too many behind, and has given rise, therefore, to populism and demagogy that we are experiencing now in many parts of the world. So the learning, I think, from the Paris Agreement's point of view of that experience is to ensure that those parts of the community who are most affected by climate change are at the front and center of the design and the implementation and the monitoring of the impact of climate change policies. The common bond between the SDGs and the Paris Agreement in this respect is it's the poorest who stand to lose the most as a result of being less resilient than other sections of the community to withstand the effects of climate change. And so it comes back to this point that if we don't have a democratic space in which civil society and general public participation can take place, and the voices of those vulnerable and marginalized communities are at the center of the table, then the Paris Agreement is going to be frustrated in the same way the SDGs will. So it all comes back, surprise, surprise, to the necessity of a human rights-based approach, which at its heart is participation, particularly of the poorest and the most vulnerable in decision and policy and lawmaking, and accountability of those who are in power. And that really can't be repeated often enough, and I hope that the ethical principles, to some extent, capture that, and I look forward to looking at them more closely. Thanks very much.
Thank you. To respond to two questions. Firstly, the intervention on behalf of the cities. And I didn't hear a lot of what you said, unfortunately, but it was important to identify the role of cities in the delivery of our climate change objectives, cities are responsible for something like 40, or not responsible for, but have the capacity to manage something like 40% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. And therefore, the programs, and they're very active programs. ECLI is an extremely dynamic organisation which incorporates the City of Mayors that have made commitments much more aggressive than their national governments in a lot of cases. So it's an important vehicle for the delivery of the climate outcome. In respect of the just transition impact of the programs that they introduce, employer organisations, domestic employer organisations and trade unions are not necessarily the best advocates. They're good on labour market issues. Climate change policies are a different deal altogether. But engagement directly between, say, the ILO through its Green Jobs Initiative with ICLI can feed the whole process down and through what ICLI and the Committees of Mayors or Conference of Mayors is looking to do. Just a huge opportunity and a way to connect the major influences over delivery of climate mitigation strategies and the achievement of labour market or proper labour market practice. In respect to the question of India and poverty in India, that's a very, very good point. Just an excellent point to raise. I mean, I'm not an advocate for the government. I don't know anything about it, but I'm familiar with its NDC, and in its NDC it makes the point that social development is paramount over climate action. So it will do climate action within which whatever is going to achieve its social objectives, which at the moment are poverty alleviation and getting electricity to those that don't have it. I know of its 1.2 billion population, it's the NDC says 300 million live in poverty and 300 million don't have electricity. So its renewable energy program in large part is intended to deliver electricity to those 300 million that have never had electricity and don't have electricity. I mean, that's a very noble and doable objective in this transition, and takes advantage of the opportunities that the NDCs create. And with that delivery of the renewable or implementation of the renewable energy, the attraction of the $1 trillion of climate finance from outside organisation must stimulate economic development, and that brings with it, and as I said, the rules for getting climate finance are the environmental and social safeguards, which flowed through to all sectors of the community, and in particular in India, with its particular circumstance. They're very targeted initiatives and provide the opportunity. But what's needed with that is active civil society or civil society activism to make sure that the initiatives are directed with the stated intent of the NDC. And again, with the direct intervention or engagement with the ILO through its Green Jobs program. Again, the domestic employer organisations and trade unions are not strong enough. They don't have the resources. They have other very, very important priorities, just getting people a decent wage and so on. So to extend their responsibilities into climate change policy is just, it's idealistic. It can't happen. So that's when the ILO, through its Green Jobs Initiative, should properly inform the government and make progress on delivery of that very, very important social outcome.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I think from the ILO, we're going to throw the ball back to you, government, employers and workers organizations, to drive the agenda. I think we want to just take one or two more questions, if there are any that you would like to react to before I turn to the panel for any closing points that you may wish to make? Anyone, just maybe one? Yes, yes, sir, please. Yeah, I do see two hands. Let's just take these two comments, questions. Sir, please.
Hello, and thank you to all. My name is Peter Sainsbury. I represent the Climate and Health Alliance from Australia. My point will sound trite, but it's got a broader implication. That is, I strongly support the idea of no one should be left behind. But the trouble with or phrases like that is it perpetuates the emphasis on the disadvantaged, that it's their problem alone rather than society's problem. And one might even better say, and this way it'll sound trite, no one should be allowed to stay ahead. That would change the emphasis. It would demonstrate very clearly that you do not have disadvantage and poverty without affluence and greed and all that goes along with that. So I just want to make that point that we need to see it as a society problem, not as a problem of just helping the poor buggers at the bottom.
Well, thank you. Yes, Madam, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Naomi Chakanya. I come from a research institute of the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions in Zimbabwe. I'd like to draw my attention, or my question, on the issues of green jobs and just transition issues. I heard from the presentations that, yes, creation of green jobs, especially in developing countries, and the just transition issue in developing countries might be difficult because of the issues of labor markets, which are not very strong enough to support issues of just transition. So I would want to hear maybe one or two nuggets from any of the presenters, not specifically to one. As a trade unionist back home in Zimbabwe, what exactly do I need to do, or the strategies that have to be put in place to ensure that whenever that just transition issue comes up, well, workers are equally rewarded, especially in the light of the labor markets, which are mostly informal? How do we make sure that just transition happens? So what are the key strategies from a trade union perspective? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I think we had very two interesting and thought-provoking ideas. I just would like to turn to the panel, and I like the idea of, if I understood well, let everybody be ahead. And from that point of view, if I understood correctly, perhaps I interpreted it in a different way, but I just would like to go with that idea and just looking from the perspectives of the ethical principles, human rights dimensions, the just transition, labor market policies, what does it mean from governments, for workers' organizations, for business sector, to just, ladies and gentlemen, turn to you for 1 minute or so of closing points on that particular point. And I'd just like to invite my colleague, Cristina Martinez, Senior Decent Work and Environment Specialist of the ILO, to give us a recap and close the session. So, Cristina, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kamal.
So, I don't know how you want to go with the
Would
panel.
we go first to the panel before I close the session? Yeah, sure. Could we start from the far end, please?
Thank you. I'll be very short because I've not participated to the whole event, so it's a little bit difficult to react to everything that has been said. But maybe the main thing I'd like to say is to invite you to that event next week. That's next Wednesday at 1:15 in the UNESCO Pavilion, where the final version of the Declaration on Ethical Principles related to climate change will be presented, and that will be the best opportunity to really explore the implications of that declaration. So I look forward to see all of you there next week, next Wednesday at 1:15, UNESCO Pavilion.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Okay. I certainly want to react. Nobody should be left behind. This is certainly our motivation to work. But as we often say, policies for the poor become very often poor policies. So we need just policies. We need social justice be the basis of all the policies. And then I think I would like what I said before, that climate change policies in essence are a distribution issue, and that it's about what kind of policies do we need, who is going to pay for it, and how are we going to organize it, and how are we organize it in a socially just way. And then you need social dialogue, you need everybody around the table, and you need an agreement in your society on where we are heading. So that was my reaction to that question. And then my colleague from Zimbabwe, in your country, what you should do to push just transition policies, especially if you have a country with a lot of with a big informal sector, the usual position of trade unions is to organize these sectors, to have these people on board, to have them organized. It happens very much, and these sectors can turn out to be very powerful. Second is lobby your governments to have climate change policies and to introduce your issues in their NDCs. It's very important. And then maybe a tricky one, lobby your colleagues. Lobby your colleagues at the trade union to also think about in all issues of all jobs that they are doing about the climate change impacts and how they can take them on board and introduce them in social dialogue, action, organizing. It should be everywhere in the things that trade unions are doing.
Thank you.
Yes, I love the comment from the Australian colleague. Should it be not nobody left behind? Should it be nobody allowed to stay ahead? I think we have the same sentiment completely, that it is the transformation of society as a whole, which can only be done by society as a whole. But I think that those who are already ahead don't have much of an interest to transform society. It will come from the empowerment of those who have the most to gain from the transformation of society, the poorest, the disempowered. And that's what I think, nobody being left behind in a human rights-based approach, that's what it's about. But I'm with you in the sentiment. Yeah.
I'd like to believe that we are discussing all these issues with the lone nexus in mind. I think it's the goal of the Paris Agreement, which is the 1.5 Celsius limit to global warming. It must be emphasized that equity under the conventions is inextricably linked to the respect for human rights. The Philippines believes that a human rights-based approach to climate actions is critical. It promotes consistency, policy coherence, accountability, and transparency in climate change policies and actions. The long-term temperature goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius is inextricably linked to human rights. Our ability to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 not only helps uphold the rights of tens of millions of vulnerable people, but also enables them to thrive by ensuring they are able to fully enjoy the rights to adequate shelter, health, jobs, and clean air and water. In short, keeping to the 1.5 allows vulnerable communities not only to survive, but also to thrive. Keeping to the 1.5 provides countries determined to act early to reap the benefits of a sustainable economy earlier than most, while accelerating programs that embed resilience in people's daily lives.
What we work for is decent work for all, and green jobs are decent jobs that either preserve or restore the environment. So in this transition to a climate resilient economy, as with any other transitions, the governments and the social partners need to ensure that labor markets function well, and they need to anticipate the changes in a timely manner so that the costs of the transitions can be addressed with the adequate measures. I didn't have time to go into the details of these measures, but basically this would encompass support to emerging green sectors, training and education and training policies, and active labor market policies that would help those directly affected by restructuring to re-enter the labor market, either through retraining, through specific employment services that would help them find the right job, through subsidies, wage job subsidies, through direct support to self-employment, or through public employment programs, in the sense that the ILO develops green public employment programs.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just transition and decent works are not policy initiatives that stand alone. They must be part of a whole of government strategy where every contributor to the delivery of both the economic, the social and the environmental outcome are actors. I put up the example of the UK Green Deal as an excellent program supported by the government, long-term targets, finance, training for workers and enterprises, but it was suspended in 2016 because the consumers didn't take it up. And so it was all for nothing. They just failed to bridge the gap between consumer interest, which is where the service delivery had to take place, and the institutions that had been set in place that would have delivered a just transition. So the market comprises all of the stakeholders, and they must all be engaged if we're going to deliver the outcomes. One final point I make, and it's interesting to note, in the country pavilions that are here, and they very proudly displaying their climate initiatives, not one refers to the commitment to the labour market and a just transition, or to gender, or to health, or whatever. So the governments are still not seeing the labour market and a just transition as core to their action on climate change.
Thank you very much to the panelists for each of the points, also to the audience here that have made additional points or complementary points. I think the dialogue that we have today included many of the aspects of the climate justice, but allow me also to talk about, for the closing, to remark or to underscore that climate justice is about finding opportunities as well, at the same time that we have a better application of transition processes for the most polluted industries, as my colleague Claire was commenting before. And of course, while many of the most polluted industries might not be labor intensive, they tend to concentrate in regionally. And that means that for some regions in the world, these mono-economic activities makes more vulnerability to the communities in the region. So we need to go deep into this analysis to better understand the measures that we put in place already, and the Philippines is a very good case, but also the opportunities for green employment should be very clear in our mind. They exist, they are ahead of us, and we need to understand how, as countries and organizations, can go ahead and grasp these opportunities. For us, the knowledge workers, I think all of us are knowledge workers here, that are able to be in a knowledge hub of innovation for climate change, as is this conference, might be more easy to see these opportunities, but for those vulnerable people, vulnerable communities, and vulnerable countries, these opportunities are much more difficult. There are, of course, many of the jobs in clean energy, even our own report next year we are anticipating 60 million, close to 60 million only in Asia Pacific of these opportunities. So on this note of sharing a future of opportunities for climate justice, let me close the panel and thank you to all the panelists for their contributions. Please join me to say thank you also to you.